going to tell you a little about Chip that you may not know. Chip is a graduate of Tompkins Cortland Community College with a degree in business management. He is also a graduate of Cornell University's S.C. Johnson College of Business, Geiston School of Management with a degree in applied economics and management. Marketing. Is that right? Specialization.
Close enough.
Specialization.
Specialization
in marketing. Yeah. Okay. He's a claims examiner and adjuster for McNeil and Company. Chip is a life member of the Glen Haven Historical Society. Mary was saying that the society actually started in '78. We started bringing Chip when he was born in 1981, so he really is a life member. He's been a trustee here, and he has been a frequent visitor at the Kellogg reading room of the Cortland County Historical Society from the time he could walk. I think Anita Wright and Mary Ann Kane sort of brought him up, so he knows history very well. He served for 5 years with me as co-historian of the Village of Homer. He's been a member of the board of the Homer Cortland Community Agency, which is the parent organization of the Central New York Living History Center, for 11 years. He served as secretary of that board. He's been president of the Homeville Museum Board, and he's presently secretary of that board. And Chip is a member of many historical societies. Today, Connecting Communities, Cortland Traction Company, and Little York Park.
I always look at the speakers here and I go, how can they be having so much trouble putting this microphone on right now? Now, a couple of things, rules of housekeeping here. I have 82 slides, I have 140 years of history, and I got 7 pages of outline here. I'm also much more nervous than any of you want to think, and you guys are giving me much more credit today and I appreciate that. That said, unlike what we normally do around here, if you can keep any comments and acknowledgments to the end, that would help me a lot. Also, I will warn you, if for some reason the projector doesn't work, we're just going to ride with it, but I think we worked most of the bugs out while you guys were all having your annual meeting. Credit where credit's due. This has been about 6 years in the making. I want to thank Mindy Tabitha and Jeff Harris down at the Historical Society. I originally did the program for them in 2016. Mindy, Tabitha were very patient with me and a huge help. Most of the information and photos I have comes from the Historical Society's collection in one form or another. Jeff provided some photographs and articles that had just come in back in 2016 when we originally did this. Big thanks also goes to Chuck Eaton over at the Homeville Museum. I originally did a couple of displays for him, one on the Traction Company and one on the 110th anniversary of Little York Park. Those were a large portion. Chuck also has a good, the Homeville Museum collection also has a good archive on the Traction Company. A lot of the material Sheldon King actually used for the original copy of his book actually came from Ken Eaton's collection. Kirby Thompson at CRT gave me more recent photos of Little York Park and for some of the plays they had done. Cargill and Mary Kimberly served as the de facto source of McGraw history of the Traction Company and were a huge moral support when I was doing it. I also want to acknowledge all 3 copies of the versions of the Traction Company book. Sheldon King wrote the original one. Sheldon and Richard Palmer co-authored the second one. Richard just released the 3rd copy. All 3 versions are different. Sourced from all 3 of them. They're very good books. They're easy to read. If you don't have a copy of the earlier ones, check out the copies the Historical Society has in their archives. They're very easy to read. Sharon Stevens has patiently videotaped me not only last time we did this program, but this time, and I appreciated getting a copy of last time's presentation to prep for this one. And finally, my family's had to live with me through all this. My mother always says every time I do a presentation or a display, it's like doing a school project all over again. So not enough patience can be doled out there. So why are we talking about the traction company at 140 years later, nearly from the time it started? It's because we were still driving over it as of very recently. Turned out all those potholes up on North Main Street was because even though the rails in Homer had been removed in 1945 and Cortland in 1942, they'd never bothered pulling the wooden ties out up from underneath Main Street. So every time a wooden tie rotted out, Main Street developed a crater. And they didn't realize that until they were doing repaving in 2016. We're also going to some of the same places that we're using some of the same things and products and going to the same places the Cortland Traction Company created, and we'll talk more about that. But to set the stage, this is what Homer and Cortland were like when we started out 140 years ago. The village of Cortland does not present the rural aspect one would expect. The horse cars traversing Main Street, the smoke curling upwards from its numerous factories, and the hum of their machinery dispelling such an illusion. And in the evening, when the streets are lighted with gas and thronged with promenaders, it is indeed a bustling little city. That's from Morris Kurtz's book in 1883. Traction Company was a little under a year old at that point when the book was published. This quote is from Homer around the same time. Homer is finally situated on the Teofnio River. The streets and walks are very broad and ornamented with beautiful shade trees which add much to the general appearance of the village. There are many very pretty residences and some fine business blocks. The Main Street extends nearly north and south. Main Street extends nearly north and south, is about a mile in length, and embraces most of the business part of the village. Near the center of the village is a beautiful park, on the west side of which stands the churches, all facing the park. The streets are lighted with gas. This is actually from 1869, but it's a fairly accurate portrayal of the way Homer was in 1882 and 1883. This is the way the red line is the way the traction company would have actually run 17 miles at its maximum point in the early 1900s. By 1879, the Homer newspaper notes that with the railroads and the omnibus companies, there's essentially a monopoly on transportation. At that point, you have stage buses, omnibuses, which are larger stages. Otherwise, you have walking. And the Homer paper in 1879 notes that some more competition would be merited, maybe get some of the transportation prices downward a little bit, and also make things more efficient to travel between Homer, Cortland, and some of the outlying villages in the county. So it definitely was an idea that had come. By 1882, surveying began in April of that year, and in June, track lines started. The Homer Horse Railway received permission from the village of Cortland to start. We're still a village. We don't become a city until 1908. And on the 9th of August, 1882, while construction was still going forth, the president of what is then called the Cortland and Homer Horse Railway notes that when they were digging up the streets to put the tracks in, they actually found the original planks from the plank road that they'd gone through earlier, which was significant for him because Goodrich himself had been a stage driver on the old Cortland-Syracuse plank road. Opening day occurred on the 5th of September in 1882. It coincided with the county fair. They had built a spur that would allow them going straight into the fair. And the original line's terminus, to go back a couple slides, at that point, the tracks went basically from the railroad tracks on the north end all the way down Main Street and ended at that point what was called the Utica, Ithaca, and Elmira Railroad, eventually would be known as the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And that's the way the track looked. It didn't go any farther than the tracks because the railroad put an injunction in place on the trolley from crossing their tracks on North Homer Avenue where the viaduct was now. It actually created a 3-year legal battle between the Cortland and Homer Horse Railway. They were concerned about the incursion in on their business that was going to take business away from them, I think. They kept it tied up in court for the next 3 years. One of the main concerns right off the bat is that there's going to be an accident. If you can see, you have a train coming through even in that area. It's coming at speeds of sometimes up to 45 miles an hour between Homer and Cortland, and you're going to put a trolley going straight across that. That's a concern as of 1883, and as we'll find out, even though everybody brushed it off at the time, it was a concern that was well-founded. Eventually, by 1885, the New York State Supreme Court brought the two sides together and came up with the following terms for the crossing. It would be a right-angle crossing. There would be planking between the rails. There would be side rail installations for safety. It would cost the traction company, and let me pause here by saying, if I say the track, we're going to call it the traction company probably from here on forth. The company goes by about 10 different names during the course of their history, and it's sometimes hard to keep track of what name goes with what era. They're going to charge what's at that point the Syracuse and Binghamton Railroad, eventually will be the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. Trolley company owes the railroad $1 for every time the trolley crosses it. And lastly, to address the safety issue, the trolley cars will stop 10 feet from the railroad crossing. The conductor will get out, dismount, walk toward the tracks, make sure the train isn't coming in, it's safe, and only then allow the trolley to come through. And that's going to be a critical issue later on. Because the trolley doesn't have permission to go north, the trolley goes to the tracks, and from the north side of the tracks all the way up to what the Parker Avenue corner in Homer now, they still run an omnibus for the first few years. In 1885, they replaced the first trolley barn, which was down in the vicinity of the Salvation Army on South Main Street, with this building on North Homer Avenue. It's a 3-lane trolley barn. Eventually it would become Plank Motors. It sat on what is now the corner of Carroll Street and Homer Avenue. And across the street from there was an open trolley shed. It had about 2 lanes in it, open solid roof canvas side. Later years, the trolley company kept the open cars, such as the later version of this style, in there that they used for special occasions like the county fair, excursions, etc. Here's the back side of the building. Eventually, the back side of the building also housed the bus company, but we're going to get ahead of ourselves. This is what the inside of the building looks like. Forgive it. It is actually a negative, but it shows the 3 lanes of the trolley that were kept inside during the night, maintained in there, cleaned in there, and gotten ready for the next day. This is actually what it looks like. We always forget when we're talking about mechanized things that there's a human side. The top photo is taken south of Cortland on 11 between Cortland and McGraw, and the lower photo shows one of the gangs that worked on and maintained it. This is what it looked like laying the rails on North Main Street in Cortland. The houses along the left side and the top of the photo are still there actually. They had to do a lot. It took a lot of work to lay the rail and to not only do it but get it right, balance the track. And once you build it, you have to maintain it. The car in the front of the photo is actually a maintenance car that was bought from Ithaca's trolley company, the Ithaca Interurban Railway. And that brings up something that's interesting. For the first several years, the trolley company has to deal with PR images, and one of which is the rumor down in Ithaca that they are only buying old trolley cars from Ithaca that are no longer good enough for Ithaca and putting them in service up in Cortland. The trolley company actually has to go into the Cortland Standard and put an article in the paper and say, that's not true, we bought the old repair car from the Ithaca Railway. Our other cars are brand new, they are safe, and they are state of the art, and don't listen to the people from Ithaca. It's not the last time a Cortlander has ever said that about an accusation from Ithaca, but it was going on even back then. Electrification comes in the early 1890s. The Cortland and Homer Electric Company is formed in 1891 with power transmission equipment that they bought from the Hitchcock Wagon Company in Cortland. They start developing Homer and they build a powerhouse on the site of what is now the Cortland County Department of Transportation. That brick building is still there, way out in the back of the, well, what's now called Traction Drive yard for the Portland County DOT. And this is what the inside of it would look like. They started developing electrical generation, not only for the trolleys. They wanted to electrify the trolleys from the start, but they also wanted to develop surplus power that they could use as a form of income and sell to local businesses and residences. There's another photo. Those are two of the first or second generation trolleys sitting out by the power company, the power generation plant. In 1894, they finally get an agreement from Homer to lay tracks. The agreement is 7 points long. Homer holds them to such things as you have to widen the stone bridge on North Main Street if we ever decide to. You have to pave down, if we ever decide to pave the road, you have to pave between the tracks. Apparently that costs a lot of money to the traction company when eventually Homer does that in 1909. They are 7 points long. Kurt Harris, Jeff Harris's father, who is also one of the really good Portland County historians, notes one of Homer's other concerns was purely economical. The businesses in Homer were afraid if there was a trolley line connecting Homer and Cortland, that Homer people would go down and do their business in Cortland and lose, the businesses in Homer would lose money. There's also concern, and this veers on the petty side, that the cheaper land prices in Homer would attract those Cortland people, and the people up in the village of Homer did not know if they really wanted them. And that's apparently a legitimate concern enough that it gets mentioned in certain sources. Thankfully, I can't blame or attribute it on anyone, but those were both legitimate concerns. Going back a year, in 1893, a side spur, the track had originally gone up Main Street, up North Main Street, and up Homer Avenue. An L-shaped spur of the line had been built down Homer Avenue to Groton Avenue, and down Groton Avenue coming in at the corner of Groton and Main, about where the Cortland house was at that point. That line would be in place for about 6 years and added not only to the length of the line, but also helped free up a little more transportation around the village of Cortland. When Homer put the tracks in, I'll just add this for a quote. Homer notes that it's all right to get incorporated, but altogether another thing to get the right of way through Homer. Homer will have a word to say before any electric road is built through the village. The other thing I should say Homer's concerned about is scaring horses. Trolleys scared the daylights out of horses, and every time the trolley puts in a new line, it notes that people would wait with their horses along the side of the road, and invariably somebody's horse would bolt across somebody's yard, break a fence. Horses were not used to these new conveyances, even though the electrical ones were very quiet, and even before the electrical ones, the trolleys had been led by horses themselves. Starting in 1895, two very big changes came to the line. First was the traction company bought 150 acres of land of what was called Salisbury Hill. It's the eastern hillside of Portland across the Teofnioke River from River Street. They wanted to build what was known as a trolley park. Now, what's a trolley park? A trolley park was an amusement park, or park in general, owned by a trolley company that generally had the purpose of A, creating an attraction to the area that would benefit everybody, but B, would generally only be accessible by track, thus providing more revenue to the line, and also giving another revenue stream. And so even by that point, you can see they're diversified. By 1895, they'll have the park, they'll have the trolley line, they'll have the electrical company. In case one of the three business propositions doesn't go well at some point, there's still a revenue stream coming into the company. With keeping in mind the extension on the line, The electrical company by 1895 was going well enough that they finally electrified the line. On January 23rd of 1895, a horse car from Homer and a horse car from Cortland meet at the barn on Homer Avenue. Dignitaries get on it, and they make a victory lap down through Cortland all the way to the Lehigh Valley station and back. Even though it is a snowy day and snow actually fills in the track, they do a mile and a half in 7 minutes. And Horace Bronson, who was the company's attorney and who'd gotten them through all the legal trouble with the railroad a decade before, was heard to have quoted, "I tell you, this is riding." By that point, half-an-hour service is in place between Homer and Cortland, and the first two houses with power are the William Kelsey residence on 38 North Church Street, which is nearly all the way up to Grant Street, and 80 Port Watson, which is also still there. It's a house that's essentially across from Cedar Street on Port Watson. There's no key showing why those were the first two houses that had electrical power in the city of Cortland, but they were. While they're planning the Traction Company Park, which they eventually call Cortland Park, there's also the decision made to run the track all the way out to Marathon. At that point, Marathon still had not been reached by the railroad yet and was only accessible by horse and by stage. Unlike Homer, which had done everything in its power basically to keep the Traction Company out, McGraw does everything in their power to get them in. McGraw goes ahead and gets all the rights of way across property. They help them figure out a route that will work. And all the companies in McGraw, eager to get a source of getting their items out to the main, at that point, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad spur in what we now consider Polkville, sign contracts for the Traction Company to carry their freight. The lines are laid across the river. This is the Elm Street Bridge that was put in place in 1895 to the park. The line continues down, and by the end of the summer, as the Traction Company Park is getting ready to open, the McGraw line is getting finished up. On the 12th of August, 1895, Cortland Park opens. Cortland Park has a pavilion. It has an amphitheater. It has two separate groves where people can relax. It has tennis courts. It has a kitchen building. It has lights. It also has a menagerie of animals, including Charlie the bear, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Charlie gets quite a bit of notoriety, especially for one of his later antics up at the Traction Company barn. A month later, on the 5th of September, the McGraw route opens up with a grand celebration. When we talk about these places opened up with grand celebrations, half of the main part of Cortland must have emptied out. The first day the park was open, there were 6,035 fares on the line, which equivocates out to about 3,000 round trips. A month later, when McGraw opens up, there are 5,126 fares on the line, and people actually waited hours to ride the trolley for the first time. There was also a celebration that day at Cortland Park. One of the big things about the trolley coming to McGraw is mail service. McGraw mail had been delivered via stage until 1895 when the trolley came. The trolley would do it for the next 3 years, and then from 1898 onward, the train, the Lehigh Valley reached McGraw, and they would go forward with it. That's the track. That's the hill up on Cortland Park, Salisbury Hill. That shows you the size of the pavilion. They said 150 acres. If you think of 150 acres, it's a good portion of the eastern hillside. That's what the line to McGraw looks like. A few less trees on the hill than there normally is. The Traction Company also sold most of the housing lots that filled up on the east side of the river. Laying tracks in McGraw much the way it had been laid in the city of Cortland. And then this is what it looked like getting to McGraw in the wintertime. For those of you who know Route 11, that house right there is still there. It's just past the Port Watson Street Bridge, but the poor thing looks nothing like that anymore. McGraw was a very hard line to maintain because in the wintertime, cars would occasionally get stuck out there, and the tracks would have to be cleared, and that often required melting the tracks off with heat. Freight was a big part of the reason for going to McGraw. There's a trolley getting stuff from the McGraw Box company. There is the main freight car for the McGraw line. That was in place from about 1903 until the end of the trolley company's tenure. Keep keep the photo of that freight car trolley in your head. That's going to show up later in our talk. Company is bustling. Then we come to November 9th of 1899. Remember what I said about the railroad having concerns about an accident? Well, on November 9th, 1899, everybody's worst fear came to light. Just after 11 o'clock in the morning, the southbound Delaware-Lackawanna and Western Milk train was coming down from Homer. It was doing about 45 miles an hour. And car 20, the trolley, was coming also southbound. Now remember, the normal procedure was for the trolley to stop 10 feet back, conductor gets off, check for the line, move on. For reasons that nobody ever figured out, that's not what happened. The flag man that was at the crossing was waving the flag violently to signal both train and trolley that both were oncoming. The train figured they had the right of way, and for reasons never fully explained, motorman Olney Chrysler never slowed down, never stopped. By the time the train realized it put on its brakes so hard that it actually broke the brake lines on the train derailed 40 feet down the track, and the train hit the trolley so hard that eyewitness accounts said it literally reduced the trolley to firewood. The conductor, Orson Smith, and a passenger, Charles Taylor, jumped off the trolley just in time. The conductor, Olney Chrysler, was thrown, one report says, at least 20 feet from the trolley. He survived with serious injuries. Passengers Margaret Kennedy and Frank Newton of Homer died. They were both thrown from the trolley. Margaret Kennedy was killed on impact, and Frank Newton was so severely injured that he didn't even make it down Homer Avenue to the hospital from his injuries. They do an inquiry. Olney Chrysler is arrested and charged with second-degree manslaughter at the coroner's inquiry. He is later declared fully negligent. As a result of the accident, the trolley company is sued for $60,000, $30,000 per person. That's the equivalent of a $2 million lawsuit. And it basically drives them into receivership. Now, in all fairness, it's not a great era for both the trolley. The train lines are also having trouble by 1900. But by the time the lawsuit settled in 1900, the trolley company is in receivership. They abandoned the line that runs down Homer Avenue and Groton Avenue, and the company gets bought and turned into, at that point, what actually does become referred to as the Cortland Traction Company as of 1901. This is just on a side note. This shows you, if you ever wondered what one of the first generation trolleys looked like, it actually looks like, well, the trolley on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. That's down by the lunchroom for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. This is a later slide by 1914, but it gives you a good idea of what riding the trolley down Main Street, Cortland, was like during the first couple of decades of the 1900s. It also shows you how closely they had to interact with horse travel. Horse travel is going to be considered bad enough, but later on, cars are going to be even more of a problem. That's Homer downtown. At one point, the traction company thinks of putting a double line up North Main Street to Homer, but it's vetoed by the residences as crowding out the horse traffic that still has to coexist. Northbound trolley car in 1907, that's getting toward the peak of the trolley company. That's down in front of the Cortland House on the corner of Groton Avenue and Main Street, Cortland. By a couple years later, those horses are going to be pretty much replaced by car travel, which is going to make the trolleys very miserable to operate. Let's go back. 1904 and 1905, Cortland Parks has been nearly open for 10 years and has been a great proposition, but the traction company wants to expand. They really want to expand all the way up to Tully. They'll never get there, but they decide to expand up through Little York to Preble, and so they propose a route going north from Hooker Avenue and Homer. With that in mind, they purchased 90 acres at the north end of Little York Lake between what's known as Big Lake down here, and Lower Lake, which is the smaller of the two lakes. They purchased about 12 acres down the west side of the lake, 78 acres between the railroad tracks, almost out to the farmland, what's now 281, and decided to build a second park. Now there are wild plans for it that include at one point a golf course to be built up there. The golf course is never built, but they do decide to go ahead with a pavilion, horse stables for anybody bringing a horse in, and picnic grounds. The line, with the plans in place for the park, they proceed forward with building the tracks. At one point, they're not sure whether they're going to go on the east side of the valley along Route 11 or the west side along what will eventually be 281. They decide the west side is better. One thing that appears to have taken place is that the tracks north of Homer were never properly balanced, and that leads to a lot of maintenance issues. Apparently, north of Little York Park, they're so not balanced that at some points the trolley company operators can't figure out whether they're actually driving on the tracks or not. It runs up pretty much parallel to 281. It goes through Little York, and it arrives in Little York for the first time on November 3rd, 1905, which is a Friday. And being a really, what I would say, a really cool school teacher, the trolley stops in front of the school in Little York and asks the teacher if the kids would like to take a ride all the way down to Homer and back. Teacher cancels school for the afternoon, and the school children in Little York get a free ride all the way down to Homer and back up on the line. In 1906, not only is the Little York to Preble spur, which is the farthest north the trolley will ever go, announced, but Little York Park opens. There's a 100-foot observation tower, there's a bandstand, there's the main pavilion, which by the way was built with wood from when they disassembled the original pavilion at Cortland Park. There is a gazebo all the way on the dock at the end of the water. There's boat and swimming concessions, and there are adequate picnic grounds. One thing it never included was amusement park rides. There may have been a carousel at Cortland Park, but the traction company wanted to make sure their parks were places people could relax, could get away from the bustling village still of Cortland, and get away for the day. Little York Park got compared to Sylvan Beach without the amusement park rides. Opening day takes place on Memorial Day of 1906. There are 4,000 to 6,000 people in attendance. There are 52 livery boats and 4 launches giving rides on Little York Lake, and most sources say that all 52 boats and 4 launches were out on Little York Lake at the same time, which if you consider the size of Little York Lake, just ponder that for a minute. You probably could have walked from one side of Little York Lake across to the other, stepping boat to boat. There are Dr. Santee's launch alone carries 445 people during the day, and over 1,000 people get boat rides Memorial Day 1906 alone. One of the reasons it's so easy to get to the park is, even by the day's standards, it only costs 5 cents to get to Little York Park from Cortland, and there are half-hour trolleys running throughout the summer. By the end of the summer, the line is completed to Preble. 18th of August is the first ride, and the park becomes a very successful and popular place in the county. At that point, it's also essentially the county's first park, so that's part of the attraction. It's nearby to the railroad line, so people from Syracuse can ride down from Syracuse, get off at the railroad station, which is roughly where K&H Kawasaki is today at the crossing, and come over via wagon. The other thing that makes it more attractive is, if you will notice the little building on the right side, that is a 12-foot by 42-foot warming barn that was added so that during the winter time people could come up and use the park in the winter time. That was built just around Christmas of 1906. There's a photo showing the boat concessions. If you'll notice, the roof is outlined with electrical lights. That's another attraction. Because they have the ability to electrify the park, the roof is outlined with light bulbs that light up at night.
Sorry to interrupt, Jim. Was that a lighthouse?
No, that is an observation tower.
Oh,
It's a 100-foot observation tower. It said that that was a great place to take your girlfriend to impress her. And this is a photo taken from the top of the observation tower. There's some indication that the observation tower actually still was standing as late as World War II. There's one post-standard article, and I don't know whether to believe it or not, because when I read the article, underneath the article in the Historical Society's Mary Ann Kane's handwriting says there's a lot of incorrect facts in here. And anytime you run across an article in Mary Ann Kane's handwriting that says there's a lot of incorrect facts, well, you take it as granted because it was her. Yes?
I got a photograph of a line from the tower.
Okay.
To the pavilion,
Yeah.
with a man on a chair doing a tightrope walk across. I'll get it to you.
That would be great. That would also freak me out. But you could do that. Patsy Conaway played regularly. There were always bands playing. It was a great source to come, and again, it got you out of Cortland, and it did it cheap. You could get there within, I think they said, a half an hour from the city of Cortland. It's a very the trolley line, we sometimes get the impression of trolleys as ambling along. These trolleys, especially once they got outside the village limits of both Homer and Cortland, there was a pretty good speed to them. Although, as I said, between Little York and Preble, they said the track was so badly built that the trolley company operators could never really open it up. Here's a photo of the inside of the main pavilion from about 1909. You'll notice Zaharis was running the concessions at that point. The same year, well, before we get there, that's the trolley right outside. Essentially, the trolley track to Little York went up the main spine of what's now the main roadway through the park. That's why in part the roadway is where it is. It weaves around through there. The trolley there. The trolley did get, that's a Sunday school group taking an excursion probably to the Little York Park in that era. And then, with everything built, this shows you the full extent of the line. I'll just take a minute and try to give you an orientation through it. Southern terminus of the trolley line is the Lehigh Valley Station down on South Avenue. Northern terminus eventually is, of course, Preble. Runs all the way up Main Street, Homer Avenue, up through Homer, up through the farm fields, up through the park. It comes in literally at the intersection of Preble Crossing and 281 there now. Keep that in mind. In Preble. McGraw, it runs out through the valley and then comes down by where the businesses are. A lot of the businesses have individual private sidings. The trolley did a lot of milk business until eventually the Gee Whiz line of the Lehigh Valley took over with the milk train up to their businesses. And at its maximum point, the trolley line was 17 miles long. There were also loops down for the Delaware-Lackawanna and Western Station. Of course, the McGraw line continued once Cortland Park had been torn down. There were still lines accessing it. And when we talk about excursions, these are not small excursions. This is an anniversary excursion of Empire Corsa Company in McGraw, and you're not reading it wrong. The small number down there says 12 cars with 617 passengers.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. Across from Patty's Pub, there's sort of there's a building. What is that?
That's the Delaware-Lackawanna and Western Roundhouse.
Okay.
So that's what would have been Elmira, Ithaca, and Utica Railways Roundhouse, and then eventually that.
And that let the trains turn around?
Yeah, that was the maintenance sheds for the Lehigh Valley.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. That's what Pavilion looked like, you can see the light bulbs running on top of it. All those would be lit up. The whole park was electrified, as Cortland Park had been. And part of the reason we went there was to see everything lit up. There's another early era. The park was pretty much packed the first few years. Another big source of revenue for the trolley line was the Cortland County Fair when it was located on Homer Avenue, where Homer Plaza is. To give you an idea on how well the trolley company did during the week the fair was operating, and not even the week, between the 17th and 20th of August 1909, the entire line had 19,000 fares. And just as when opening day of the parks and the lines, most of it is attributed to the parks, most of the 19,000 fares is attributed to the trolleys. What they would actually do is run chains of trolley cars, the open cars that we've seen before. They would put them behind the motorized ones and run them like a train down from Homer and up from Cortland. And very enterprising juveniles would jump on the last car at the last minute and either evade having to get paid or they'd just jump from car to car to avoid the conductor. Very common practice. Here's another slide. It was a big deal. When you didn't have cars and you didn't have far to go, the county fair was a very big local opportunity. But with all this talk about the trolley company, what's interesting is if you read books like Grips, you read the Cortland County Industrial Editions, even in the very early 1900s, the traction company doesn't spend too much time talking about the trolleys. They talk about the power company, and they talk about the park. The power company at that point is developing electric lights. There are a lot of houses within the city. There's a city of Cortland by this point and Homer that have power. The factories all have power. It also doesn't require the mechanical upkeep and the accounting that the trolley does. The trolley very soon will become a losing proposition, and the traction company is promoting the two divisions of the business that are becoming far more profitable, and also them doing so is a sign of the future. The peak of the trolley really comes during the 19-teens. That's right at the intersection again of Main and Groton. What's interesting now is you can see the cars. The cars were becoming a pain in the neck. The drivers were, automobile drivers were said to have had really very little regard for right-of-way and yielding to trolleys and were often very rude to the drivers. At one point, after cars came along, Thomas Lanigan, who was the longest-serving conductor in the trolley company, he actually worked for them for 38 years. Basically from the beginning until actually they had already gone to buses. Lanigan was getting high-beamed by an automobile, and he finally got so tired of it that he stopped in the middle of Main Street, grabbed the switch bar off the trolley, and broke the headlights out of the automobile. One account of the story has it unfortunately happening right out in front of the trolley company's headquarters that were at that point in the old Randall Bank building. And much to his credit and his respect as an operator, he did not get fired for the antic. Little York toward the end of the night, probably the end of World War I, approximately that era. Life is pretty much settled down. You can see the bandstand, a couple enjoying the afternoon, some of the cooks from the main pavilion taking a break. You can see the gazebo and the docks and the boathouses that were out in the end. It's a shame none of that stuff is still there. And then, of course, a scene that looks really familiar even to this day. A bunch of kids swinging in Little York Park. There's a pretty good crowd. Something must have been going down on the lake that day. By 1921, probably got street lighting. And that's pretty good considering most areas don't get rural electrification until the 1930s. Also in 1921, electricity was offered to farmhouses all the way out Tompkins Street extension from the city line all the way to South Portland. And again, Virgil will get power a few years. Even places like Virgil will be offered power by the end of the 1920s, and that's still ahead of the rural electrification project the federal government did. And everybody always says Main Street doesn't quite get the winners we used to. And I, for one, am glad We don't. That's down in front of what's now the deli downtown, Sarvay's. I made a comment when I did this program in 2016 that I was really hoping I never saw Main Street like that. That was in August of 2016. And then we had the March 2017 snowstorm. The piles were not that high, but by the time the blizzard stopped in March of 2017, the next day, the piles were high enough in front of Mullins, right up the street from where this was taken, that from across the street you could nearly not see the first floor windows. And when you walked down that portion, you were essentially walking through at least a waist-high tunnel of snow. So, famous last words by historians giving presentations. Thankfully, they were that high. Winter maintenance, we'll show some slides later. Winter maintenance was always a pain in the neck, and in part that's what's going to add to the demise of the trolley. In 1926, Cortland City, the trolley company starts using buses. They buy 2 Brockways and establish the Cortland City bus lines, and they start reducing the number of trolley tracks in the city. They start going more to buses. And during 1926 to 28, they systematically discontinue the trolley runs throughout the city of Cortland. They're still running to Little York and Homer. They're still running to McGraw. In fact, with Little York and Preble, a big part of the business is getting students to Homer School. They're the first bus system Homer uses for north of the village. Cars are taking over. People are able to drive farther. People are able to get places more easily, and even at that point, Homer and Cortland are really becoming car towns. We drive everywhere. And in the process, things aren't going too well at the park. We estimate that photos from the late 20s, and that would make sense because in 1927, rumors have circulated that the main pavilion is a fire trap. And the rumors are so strong that the traction company has to bring down an engineer from Syracuse to confirm that the rumors are not true, it's not safe. On the other hand, you can see the tops are off the boathouses. They've torn out the wooden pier, and it's down to a stub that's mainly concrete with some decking over top of it. People are going elsewhere. They're going farther afield. They're going to Sylvan Beach. They're going to Ithaca. They're going all over the place. They're going up here to the lakes. Why go to Little York if you can go all these other places? There's a plan by the end of the summer of 27 for Sydney NOAA to take over concessions, restore the parks, and actually put amusement features on there. But it never really appears if that was done or not, or if that was too little too late. On April 13th in 1928, the Cortland Traction Company is actually sold to the Mohawk Hudson Power Company, what eventually will become Niagara Mohawk. They're interested in the power transmission. And while they reassure everybody that the trolleys aren't going everywhere, Charles Churchill, who was the last head of the Cortland Traction Company's Cortland office, and who later becomes the president of Cortland Savings Bank, is named vice president and general manager of the Cortland operation. And he acknowledged years later that they had no interest in keeping the trolley company, the trolley lines going. At that point, the trolleys were losing money. They had no feature, and he said in the case of Little York Park, we only put in enough money to keep it going. He said we were interested, the priority was on the power company, the others were money-losing propositions, and we were just hoping to get rid of them. Also in 1928, the Portland Traction Company goes to the New York State Public Service Commission and petitions to end the service to Little York and Preble. It's fought by the locals. The hearings will reveal the raw reality that the line from Homer, well, overall on the line, it's costing $83,957.73 to run trolley operations for all 17 miles. They're losing $18,718.94. It doesn't sound like a lot, but essentially that's looking at a $250,000 loss on revenue of $1.2 million if you use today's dollar. That's a huge loss. They also note that on the Little York to Preble line alone, it is costing them what would be the equivalent today of $69,000 to run it, and I'm sorry, $144,000 to run it, $69,000. In those days, that equivocates out to it's costing us $10,000 to run it. We're only making $4,000 in revenue. They also said if we keep going with the Little York and Preble line, we're going to have to replace 15,000 ties. It's going to cost us $40,000, which is over $500,000 in today's money. It's just not worth it. People said, how will our kids get to school? It's not fair. How can you do this to us? And the traction company says to the Public Service Commission, we're getting $350 a year from one school district up in that valley. We're getting $450 from another. It's just not worth it. The Public Service Commission agrees, and so on April 1st, 1929, service north of Homer was discontinued. This is one of the reasons that was such a pain in the neck. The trolley operators talk about getting stuck out north of Homer, and when they say stuck, we're talking about, in the case of both out toward McGraw and from Homer outward, the tracks would fill up with snow and freeze, and trolley cars were known to get stuck overnight, which was not a good proposition. Meanwhile, the buses are becoming more popular. That's one of the first Brockway buses. That is Buck Towsley, a driver who was a fixture on Cortland for years. I have yet to figure out where that is, but it's the Elm and Clinton line. And so sometime when I get some time, I'm going to see if I can figure out where that house is, because frankly, I'm curious. As we look toward the end of the trolley line, here are some mementos. There's a conductor's badge. There is a trip sheet, and there's a schedule from 1921. Going back a few years, this is a neat piece. This is a reversible seat that was used on the Little York line. You can see that photo. When the cars would go north, the seat would flop, and so the people didn't have to turn around. The people could just still be looking forward in the opposite direction. As far as we know, that's the only one left. That bench was donated to the village of Homer from a house on Warren Street, and Mark Sweeney, the town and village historian, let us borrow that for our display for a few years down at the Living History Center. That's a really neat piece, and it's still in excellent shape. It's a real testament. That's the infamous sign that was growing into the tree in McGraw for years. It disappeared from the tree one day in the middle of the night. Mary Kimberly now has it, and I will tell you she's not the one who cut it out, just so anyone doesn't think she's guilty.
Homer had one too on a tree near the bridge.
Yeah, and I wish I knew what happened to that. It's probably sitting in somebody's garage at this point. They're not fussing up to the...
1960.
Well, somebody probably put it in their garage and didn't want to fess up that they were the one that cut it out of the tree in Homer in the middle of the night. What's interesting is the tree grew into the sign grew into the tree, but if you go down to the McGraw Historical Society and see the sign, the part that grew into the tree is actually in really good shape. It was a porcelain enamel sign, and it's still in excellent shape to this day. The guy who cut it out of the tree was actually afraid something was going to happen to it, and so fortunately, he got it when he did. In the meantime, with everything going on with the trolley line, things are still going at Little York Park. George Fuller, who's a band leader, leases the dance hall for a season in '29. The buildings are remodeled that year finally. The road is widened, and there's still talk of dances being held there. By 1929, Mohawk Hudson Power runs a power transmission line up from Binghamton to the city of Cortland, establishes a power substation approximately probably where the one currently is, across the Port Watson Street Bridge on the way to Polkville. They also run another line down from Oneida to Homer and Cortland, and at that point they stopped generating power for the line out of the Cortland powerhouse. In 1930, the traction company divests its interest in the Cortland bus line, which becomes an independent entity, And by the early part of 1931, it becomes obvious that the days of Trolley Company are coming soon. The last run was scheduled to take place on the 15th of February 1931 from Cortland to McGraw. However, on the 13th, there's a bad snowstorm. The plows plow in the tracks, the lines freeze, and they decide to finish off service 2 days early. 15th of February 1931, which I believe is a Sunday, Thomas Lanigan, the longtime, at that point 36-year veteran, runs the last trolley line. And there's no fanfare for it. It's a night run. It goes up to Homer. It comes back. The trolley pulls in the barn at night, pulls in. That's it. Next morning, the 16th, buses are running all through Homer and Cortland with no fare. Freight service will, some of the freight operations will still continue in McGraw for a few months until the companies make arrangements with the Lehigh Valley to get their freight. But otherwise, as of mid-February 1931, the traction company is done. Trolleys go up for auction, and then in a very weird twist of irony, there's a lot of demand for them. There's so much demand for the surplus trolley cars that they have to work up a system on who gets the trolley cars. A lot of them are said to have ended up on Little York and Song Lake area as camps, such as this one. At least one ended up in Suggett Park as a warming station for the ice rink. There's another photo of one ending up in Little York Park as a warming station, and that one was actually, if you ever want to see a photo of that, there was an early 90s Cortland County Historical Society calendar called Lost Cortland or Forgotten Cortland, and there's a photo of the waterworks warming station in there. The bell apparently at one point was all that was left of this car up on Song Lake. This one ended up out behind a shed of a house. That was located approximately where the King's Den hair salon is located on Tompkins Street. It was used as a storage building. At one point there was rumors that somebody wanted to use one as a beauty salon. People came up with a lot of wild ideas. The Elm Street Bridge actually got a second life. After the trolley stopped using it, the Port Watson Street Bridge needed to be replaced. The Port Watson Street Bridge was actually from 1886 at that point and needed to be fully replaced. So while they had that out of commission, they turned the track surface of the Elm Street Bridge into a road surface and used it as the detour. It was actually so successful that when the Mohawk Hudson Power Company divested the bridge, they sold it to Angelo Natoli, who owned property on one side of the river. He owned the bridge and let it get operated as a road bridge. Another man, Mr. Bush, actually also ran it as a road bridge into the 1950s, and it was finally torn down sometime in the 1950s, having probably much overserved its lifespan. But what's happening with Little York Park? It's still around at that point, but we don't have any records that it was used after 1932. John McAvoy actually had the last lease on it for the 1932 season, and then it sat vacant and boarded up, and the weeds developed. But that also created a gap and a hole in Cortland County because there was nowhere to take your company picnic or your excursion group for your social organization. The Homer Town Board in 1938, it's noted, along with the Pomona Grange, both support that the park be bought by the county as a county park. Much of the park system we know of in the county now, the city parks, don't really exist anymore. There's nowhere to do a big group picnic like there had been for all these years, where you could take, well, several hundred people. If you're Brockway or one of the factories down in McGraw, your Thompson, one of those companies, there's nowhere to hold a big company picnic. Around the same time, Little York Garden Club is also really concerned what's going to happen to the park. They don't know if it's going to be turned into some rowdy establishment, or if it's going to continue to rot, and maybe attract a not so good group of people. And so in 1938, the Little York Garden Club puts on a very die-hard campaign to the Cortland County, at that point what's known as the Board of Settlements, will eventually be known as the county legislature, to purchase the park. And Mohawk Hudson Power Company is very much in favor of it. They actually priced the option to buy it at $7,500, which Kurt Harris notes was lower than they could have gotten otherwise. But the power company itself doesn't want to see the park become a rowdy dance hall where there would be drinking, dancing, and carousing at that point. And so they offer to sell it to the option to Cortland County for $7,500. The Little York Garden Club members put on a campaign that to this day is still considered legendary, and they drive the Cortland County Solons nuts. And they do it for years. And eventually, by the end of 1938, it goes up for a vote in Cortland County. There is opposition in Cortland County, though. One of the reasons it takes so long to go through is a lot of areas of the county that are farther away, like Cincinnatus, Willett, and Solon, basically protest saying, we're not going to get any benefit. We're on the opposite side of the county. We're coming out of the Depression. We literally have no money at this point. Why are you throwing in money at a bunch of decrepit old park buildings that are falling in? Why would you do this? And fortunately, the Little York Garden Club and other members of the legislature see enough interest that they put it up for a vote. On the 9th of November, 1938, the vote passes by 7. The vote to purchase the option literally passes by 7 votes. Only the city is fully in approval of it. The 5 Northwest towns support it, but the other 10 towns in the county vote it down. The WPA administration is offered a chance to develop the park in 1939. The federal government turns it down. In 1939, the county votes, the Board of Solons vote 13-6 to purchase the park finally. The New York State Parks Commission notes in 1940 that they don't want it either, so the county decides to go ahead, and by 1941, within 2 weeks of when their option to buy the park goes up, they finally buy the park on the 3rd of September 1941. At that point, the park is down to 85 acres. It's not clear how many of the buildings are left, but then World War II happens. We did mention the trolley tracks are scrapped during World War II for the war effort, and the park sits. And that's the way the upper photos are the way it looked. The Boy Scouts and the Y are said to have used it as a day camp during the 1940s. I think I'm going to say the kids were a lot tougher then than they are now. Because if the park is in half the condition that it looks up there, it is really wild and woolly. After the war, once things are looking better though, the county has been saving money up all those years, and they have a $50,000 post-war planning fund. And they decide to use it to develop the park. And one advantage to using the fund is the county doesn't have to raise taxes, and they're very proud of that. They go to the residents of the county and they say, we're going to redevelop the park. We've already had the money put aside for projects such as this, and don't worry, don't freak out, it's not going to raise your taxes. So during the late 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, they start restoring it. And William J. Dwyer, the head of the County Highway Department, is the champion of it. He's the evangelist in the county for the efforts. He really wants to see this happen, that once again the county can get a really nice place where people can go and enjoy themselves on a nice summer day. And thanks really to his hard work, it becomes a reality. In June of 1952, the park opens. Pat Kiley and Don McGraw are the concessionaires. Don drove all the way to Leavenworth, Kansas, and bought a carousel. They have a petting zoo, a kiddie pool, There's a restaurant they run in the main pavilion. That's what the park looked like when it reopened. What's neat about that photo is it's clearly done before 81 came and actually sawed through the eastern half of the park, but it can show you how it looks coming back. In 1955, the Tiny Mite train was opened with a 1,000-foot track through the park. In 1959, the park was dedicated to William J. Dwyer, who had passed away the year before, in recognition of his efforts. And I told you this wasn't going this way. There it is. There's the carousel Don got from Leavenworth, Kansas. With all this good stuff going on, well, like any place, sometimes you have to take the bad with the good. In 1955, there are complaints to the Cortland County Legislature of drunken partiers, rowdiness, destructive vandalism, even skinny dipping taking place. At one point, the vandalism gets so bad that the vandals destroy the entire restroom facilities in the park, and they're just not happy about it. So increased policing takes place at the park. Things calm down for a few more years. In 1956, a baby monkey is actually born in the park. Life goes back to normal, and then gets interesting again. In 2016, when I first did the, 2016, when I first did the presentation, CRT actually did West Side Story. And of course, everybody knows West Side Story. There are gangs, there are knife fights, back and forth. And it turned out really all they were doing is repeating history. Because on the night of July 11th, 1958, they had a sock hop up at the park. And WNDR Syracuse DJ Raleigh Fowler comes down and flips some records. IFTA band Bobby and the Counts, that's Bobby Comstock Sr.'s band comes up from IFTA, and they hold a sock hop evening. And unfortunately, at some point, the Syracuse hoods start duking it out with the kids from Ithaca. And the Cortland kids see that the Ithaca kids are outnumbered, so they join in and they start a brawl. Now, nobody reports what exactly happened. And like most good news articles, there are conflicting stories. The newspapers say there are only 35 people, and that's just not plausible because they got the entire Cortland County Sheriff's Department nearly out there to the park because they had a full-on brawl going on. One report a month later, they said tear gas was used, there were brawling, there were knives, there were fights. I've heard stories that there were guns and zip guns and bike chains. It gets bad. The sheriff gets up there. The report says tear gas was used. A car stopped in Nedrow later that night by Onondaga County Sheriff, and the guys who were in the car have lead pipes and bicycle bike chains in the car, and they're arrested. There are arraignments done. The state police is called in. However, there are only 2 state troopers on duty that night, and they're out serving the arrest warrant on Truxton, and by the time they get there, the sheriff's department's broken up the brawl. A month later, for those of you who were around back then will remember George Cober, and George was running the state trooper barracks in Homer at that point. He said tear gas was not used because the only people who were authorized to use tear gas were the state troopers, and the state troopers were on Truxton, and there's no way the sheriff could have used it. There were arraignments. Nobody knows how it turns out. It's also an event that I found out people don't like to talk about, but I think it makes it a lot more colorful. Back to the good times. There's the Tiny Mite train going over the they filled in the track so you could go do like we said, it's a 1,000-foot long track. And if you remember, people were still tripping over that doggone track in the 80s and 90s long after the Tiny Mite was long gone. And once again, people were using it for events. There's the Brockway 1966 clam bake, and this is also from a Brockway clam bake. They had people skydiving into the field beside the park. That's pretty neat. The park really was having another heyday. It was getting used, it was getting enjoyed. More amusement parks rides were added during the 60s. Pat Kiley and Don McGraw ran the concessions through the early 60s. However, both of them had day jobs, and at one point, running Low York got so intense that Pat's daytime employer, who you said was...
Don's was Jerky.
Okay, whoever Pat's daytime employer said, you can either do Low York Park or you can have a job here, but we're not going to let you keep doing both. So Pat stopped doing it after 1963. Don McRae's daughter told me that her father did it for one more year after Pat stopped, but chemistry with his new partner never really gelled during the 1964 season, so her father sold the concessions after the 1964 season. And a few years later, the park got another boost. Starting on February 15th of 1972, David Yeaman and Dr. James Palmer from SUNY Cortland had formed the Cortland Repertory Theater the year before, and they announced 1972 would be their debut season. They would do it at the Pavilion. They outfitted the second floor, which had originally been a dance hall, and they got the theater seating from the State Theater, which was being torn down at that point. Then they created a repertory theater. The first few seasons are rather intense. The first season included Fiddler on the Roof, The Fantastics, Your Good Man, Charlie Brown, Robin Hood, which was the program for the kids, and also the Bremen Town Musicians for the kids. The season ran from June 29th to August 13th. There were 300 seats. And what made it so complex is during the first few years, instead of doing a 2-week cycle of each play, every few nights they did a different play throughout the summer. So it was truly a repertory theater. So the performers had to get used to going on and off, and in some cases I'm sure there were some who were doing parts in all the play. It wasn't until years later that they went to the 2-week cycle. That's been a very, at the risk of stating the obvious, it really gave a boost to the park, and it has continued to. It's also attracted a few famous alumnuses, such as Hollywood actress Holly Hunter, Stephen Bogardus, and Joe Montello, who are both well-renowned actors on Broadway. Even to this day, here's a few photos Kirby gave me from the 2014 season. Les Mis, All Shook Up, Ring of Fire. And I will say this, it is amazing the amount of talent that they can shove on that second floor. If you think of a full-size musical like Les Miserables or some of the other musicals they've done, given the space they have, which is much smaller than any stage, it's absolutely amazing. The other thing I'd like to point out is enough credit cannot be given to CRT for keeping that pavilion in one piece. Because every time the pavilion has needed an upgrade, whether it's a sprinkler system, whether it's accessibility issues, whether it's simply a roof on the building, CRT has contributed money to it. They get hundreds and thousands of, they've got thousands of people up to that park over the year. Every night during the summer it's thronged. It's being used. It gets people into Cortland County, it gets people into restaurants, it gives businesses the local economy a boost, and it keeps the park going so that what happened in the 1930s will never happen as long as they're there. It really helps keep the doors on the park open. They're a great group of people. It's a lot of dedication and effort, and enough can't be said of what they've done to help keep the park open, especially as popularity of some of the activities they've had, other groups have had up there have sort of come and gone over the years. One of the big events that started on July 4th, 1973 was the Cortland County Heritage Day. And the county did activities up there, and they asked local craftspeople to come up. Sterling Plank, who as a sidebar had taken over the bus company. Sterling Plank used to display his bikes up there. Kenny Eaton, of course, would always bring his model train, and then various other craftspeople would come up, some of which look far more familiar to us, would come up, and it was a really great celebration. That must have gone on for about 30 years, and it was a really great thing to take your family to. The park was strong, and it brought people up to the park. It also exposed a lot of people to crafts and other trades that even at that point were dying out and you didn't see too often anymore. It was a fun day had by all. Now, speaking of Sterling Plank, the bus company had gotten sold to a former employee in 1938, and he ran it until 1945. He said the bus company was a losing proposition. It nearly wore him out during the 40s. And so in 1945, he sold it to Sterling Plank. Planks ran the bus company through Cortland until 1965. At that point, it was losing revenue badly enough that when they asked Cortland to help subsidize it, the city of Cortland wouldn't do it. They sold the bus line to Swartout and Ferris, who ran it for a few years, and it died out. And we want to bring in, unfortunately, Sterling Plank's name for another reason, because on 1982, another unthinkable happened. On January 11th of 1982, a plumber was thawing pipes in the back of Plank Motors. Now, Plank Motors was the original, had been the trolley company, had been the bus line. Plank had turned it into a car dealership. One of the Planks said it, once commented regarding the vehicles, they said we had every brand that went out of business in America for several decades. They sold Packards, they sold American Motors, you name it. If it was a car company, they sold Nash's. You name it, if it was a car company that went out of business in the mid-20th century at one point or another, Plank believed they had sold it. They were trying to thaw pipes out in the back of the building in January 11th, 82, and the building caught on fire. At that point, the building was being occupied not only by Plank Motors, but by Osborne's carpet business. It also had Sterling Plank's car collection, which at that point was valued at about $100,000, according to the paper. The fire was so bad, the building actually had 2 flash explosions in it. It was the worst fire the Homer firefighters had seen since the 1970s. And Kevin Whitney told Tabitha down at the Historical Society that the fire was so bad that the firefighters in town still talk about it. It was right in the middle of the winter. The water, of course, there was freezing anytime you get that. Very bad day, very hard day, very sad day. But life moves on. With the July 4th Heritage Days came the fireworks, which have gone on for many years. But with also the coming of the mid-'80s came the end of the concessions. The concessions will run until the end of the 1985 season. In October of '85, Glenn Munson did an auction per Jim Neal, who had the concessions contract at that point, and all the rides and concessions up at the park were sold off. Former concessionaires Don McGraw and Burton Rowe were in attendance, and both said it was a very sad day. Transitions keep happening, the fireworks keep going, and other things keep happening at the park. Starting between the early 1970s and up until a few years ago, one of the last events in the season was the Cortland Antique Car Club's car show, which was always a fun afternoon unless it was raining, at which point the field turned into a mud pit. A lot of fun, always a great way to end your season. Other events such as the Celtic Festival, there were bluegrass festivals that had been held there over the years. Also in the 1980s, another piece, the Hooker Avenue Bridge, where the trolley company crossed over the rail line on Hooker Avenue and Homer, was taken down. And by the 1990s, despite some efforts to buy some adjoining land, the park was down 57.5 acres and basically the way we know it today. This is the way it looks. Basically, it's looked the same since the 1950s. We don't really have photos of the way it looked before, so we don't know how it looked earlier on. That's the road going back toward the current restroom facilities. Follows the line the trolley company took up to Little York, and eventually when the county bought it, I forgot to mention, one of the reasons the park was such a good incentive for the county was that it came with the right-of-way to the trolley line. And so a lot of what's now 281 running between Little York and Preble, the reason it hooks into the center of the valley is the county followed the old trolley lane right-of-way all the way up into the village of Preble. Still hasn't changed a whole lot. That's taken approximately from the angle where the dock would have gone straight out into the lake in the early days. And remember that old freight car? It's the 1903 freight car that ran all the way till 1931 in McGraw. Well, it still exists, as most of you know, only it's now a camp down on Ayers Road off of Colebrook. It was turned into a camp. John Gustafson owned it for a long time. Niederhoppers has owned it. It's gone up for sale several times in the past few years. And it's still providing smiles to people. It's still up there. If you drive by it, you can see it down on Ayers Road. And it still looks basically like a freight car with a couple of additions on it. So why does all this still matter? Because we're still having the same conversations we were having in the 1880s. We're still concerned about the amount of green space we have in the county and having access to it. We still ask a lot of questions about the amount of public transportation we have or should have. Transportation infrastructure is still as important as ever, even more so now that there's not always the money to fix it. In those days, a lot of the transportation infrastructure focused on the railroad, the trolley rails, and the Route 11 corridor. Now at this point, we've switched over to the 281 and Route 13 corridors and Interstate 81. And maybe most importantly and troubling enough, we're still having conversations about connecting an increasingly disconnected county. One thing both the Preble folks and the McGraw folks said when the trolley reached them in 1895 in the case of McGraw and 1906 in the case of Preble said is, for the first time ever, they didn't feel like they were outliers in the county, especially Preble. Preble always felt like it was an outlier, and they said once the trolley finally got to Preble in 1906, they finally felt like they were a part of Cortland County, and they finally felt like they were neighbors with the people in Homer and Low York. And that's important. And now we're having a similar we're still having conversations about disconnected community. Only it's ones we do ourselves. We go to work, we come home, we get on electronic devices, we don't go out in public, we don't go to parks. And in some ways, we're probably even more disconnected than we were in the 1800s. And that's a conversation that anytime anybody does a public event, it always gets said about those who are working it. I wonder why we can't get more people to come out. We need to figure that out because every year we get to know our neighbors a little less and a little less. That's too bad. When you see 6,000 people filling Low York Park in one day, that's a pretty amazing number. That's a lot of community happening. We're still talking about it also because we're still living it out. The buses still follow some of the old trolley routes up through Homer and Cortland. Dwyer Park continues to be enjoyed regularly and 3 seasons of the year. And most importantly, all our homes and businesses have electricity, and we can thank Cortland Electric Company for that. And finally, why are we still talking about it? On a lighter note, we're still talking about it because somewhere in Cortland County right now, somehow a pothole is forming due to another piece of disintegrating, forgotten trolley track. Thanks very much. Any questions?
You didn't tell us about the bear.
Oh, I didn't. I didn't tell you about the bear. The bear, like I said, the bear's name was Charlie. And Charlie, when he wasn't kept in a cage up in Cortland Park on the east side of the river, was kept in a cage. He hibernated in what eventually became a rather shoddy cage in the back of the traction company barn. And in 1904, when they were loading Charlie from the cage in the barn onto a wagon to take him over to Cortland Park, Charlie got a little ornery. And he bolted into the box, then turned around and ducked back out into his cage and started freaking out enough that he actually broke out of his cage and went after the 3 trolley company employees. And he literally treed them in the rafters of the trolley company barn enough that one of them had to climb out a 2nd-story window, go across to a hotel across Homer Avenue, and get some ether on a cloth, climb back in the 2nd-story window, and they dangled the ether on a cloth down and right near Charlie's nose, and eventually Charlie passed out, and then they took Charlie, loaded him on the wagon, and got him up to the car quickly enough. Thank you. But people remember it. When Sheldon King did the book in the 60s and the 70s, people who were children at that point still remembered how cool it was to see the bear at Cortland Park, and it was a big deal when their parents took them. One person said, I can't remember much, but I can remember the bear. And monkeys and everything else going on.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that the Mohawk Hudson Power Company is overseen by the Public Service Commission.
Yeah.
I've seen in a couple of deeds on properties on the west side of the lake that the rights of way are shown in the deeds right up through their property. What happens to those rights of way?
That you would have to ask a lawyer or attorney or bureaucrat who knows about
So
rights of way.
does that right of way still exist?
I would say so. National Grid probably owns them now.
Yeah, it would be
You can also have
National
so much
Grid.
property.
Theoretically, the right of way, unless the person who holds the right of way formally releases the right of way. It's the same thing that the town owns a certain amount of land on each side of the road on your property to maintain the road. As long as it exists, theoretically, they could probably put a trolley track right up through the properties on the west side of the lake.
And that would be-
Or power line, it's,
Ask them. Never.
okay, wait a minute, we have a real estate person.
I don't have the answer.
You're asking a historian, I mean, I figured, I was going to say, I'm going to absolve any, I'm being videotaped, so I'm not going to say a thing on it. One of the reasons they may have kept it is the power, exactly what you said, which is by keeping the right of way for the trolley line, the power lines went right up the trolley corridor. And so it's not that they would ever want to build a trolley there, but it allows them to keep the right of way for the power lines, which still run up the west side of the lake, and allows them to access it and maintain it. Because remember, it would be to their interest to keep it because the only thing Mohawk Hudson wanted was the power lines. And you have this network of power lines through the county, and as long as you have right of ways, you have access to your own power lines. And some of those are hard fought. The lines up, in the case of the Low York line, in some cases they had to move houses and barns backwards to get the line up the west side of the valley. So it's a big deal. It's not something, McGraw gives their rights of way out, please come. Other parts of the system, they have to kick and scream and get people to sign over because they don't want a trolley going up through their yard. Any other questions? Yes.
The viaduct between Portland and Homer,
Yes.
why was that built? When was it?
The viaduct was actually not built. The original version was built in 1921 as a bridge-like structure. It was not the best built thing. One source notes that cars had a lot of accidents coming up and over it. The trolley actually ran up and over it from 1921 to 1931. Why they didn't build one sooner after the 1899 accident never ceases to amaze me. The more permanent concrete one was built in 1940, and that's the one that they finally took down a few years ago. It's still, and that's, if you'll notice, that's why it goes at essentially a right angle to the rail bed. Any other questions? Yes?
I remember the monkeys. How long were they there?
The
New
mon-
York Park.
Yeah.
Danny Houlihan took the animals to New York Park. He was the superintendent of the water board. There was a big, huge fence that was 12 to 18 feet high, and it had deer in it, and it had animals in it, and people left their personal domesticated animals, dogs, etc., harassed animals behind the fence in the park, so no longer would there be animals there.
Okay.
Probably in the 1950s or early 60s. The
For-
same thing happened at the waterworks. There
For-
were peacocks, there were all kinds of animals there.
Well, and again, the history of having animals at the park had gone back to Cortland Park. For those who didn't hear it, and for the sake of the video, I mean, Cortland County, the concessionaires had animals in a menagerie, you said 12 to 18 foot fence, upward at Low York Park, and the problem was people would let their domesticated animals, like their dogs, harass the animals, which didn't make a good experience for the animals or other people visiting them. And so eventually the animals went away sometime, well, the monkey was born there in 1956, so sometime after the late 50s, that would have gone away probably. The animals were definitely gone by the time I remember in the 1980s. And do you remember the animals there in the 70s?
I don't remember the animals, their anthems, I should remember the monkey pulled their hair.
Okay, my aunt remembers that the monkey yanked her hair at one point when she was a kid. I've heard her say that. It was not exactly one of her more fond memories. Any other questions? Yes.
Was there a diner that was made from one of the trolley cars in Cortland, over near the camera shop on South Main?
Okay, the diner over by the camera shop was not. That was actually a purpose-built diner because the one next to the camera shop, by the way, where the camera shop offices were was the final traction company office. During the 20s and early 30s, that actually included a showroom that had devices that ran on electricity for your home as an encouragement for you to get your home electrified. That was actually a purpose-built diner because that diner was eventually moved across the street and is now what's Frank and Mary's. And that was actually a purpose-built diner. Any questions? Well, thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for your patience.